Alright guys, here's our first installment of Routine Maintenance. This is going to be a segment where we focus on breaking down and analyzing the individual posing routine of the athletes at the night show of a bodybuilding competition. For our first installment of this segment, I'm going to go ahead and analyze my own posing routine from the NPC San Francisco show from 2010. Further down the road, we'll be using other people's posing routines as well, so we'll be accepting any footage that people would like to submit for us to analyze, as well as the footage that we get personally from the competitions that we attend. So let's talk about what the athlete did wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but could have done better. One thing that stands out is the constant rocking motion and the inability to hold a pose for a certain duration of time longer than 1 to 2 seconds. As you see, the athlete hits a pose and begins to jerk. That's a sign of being uncomfortable. Ideally, the athlete would want to master his posing and be comfortable on stage. That way, once he hit the pose, he'd be comfortable holding it, knowing how good he looks, and it wouldn't be nearly as shaky or as uncomfortable looking. Another thing is that the athlete doesn't seem very mindful of his facial expression and where he's looking while he's performing his poses. This can lead to some serious problems, because if you don't have a plan as far as where you want to look during your posing routine, you'll end up looking blankly into the audience, or sometimes just focusing on the facial expression that you make while you're trying to contract the muscle, instead of what facial expression might best complement that pose. There's one more noticeable problem that stems from the original problem discussed, where the athlete did not hold his poses long enough. That problem has led to some of the poses being hit obviously faster, and therefore the athlete is not able to remember or focus on which muscle groups need to be flexed and contracted for each of the poses. There are multiple times in this posing routine where things such as the glutes or the abdominal area should have been contracted, but since the athlete was posing so fast and not holding his poses long enough, he was only able to focus on some of the muscle groups in the upper body that he felt needed to be posed. Ideally, the athlete would want to hit a pose long enough to be able to focus on which muscle groups needed to be flexed, contracted, etc. in order to make the pose look its best. Certain poses look much better while you have your glutes or abs contracted, or sometimes you don't need to contract something the way you would think you would need to. Therefore, practice, practice, practice. That's going to be the key to making sure that you know how to hit your poses when you hit them on stage. Now, looking at what the athlete did right, or things that stood out in the routine that are commendable, the posing was very creative. So the choice of poses was very unique. Notice how he's not just doing mandatory poses and quarter turns. This is the individual posing around, and this is where your creativity really stands out. This is your opportunity to hit poses that make you look your best. Sometimes you feel like the mandatory poses or quarter turns might not display your physique the best, and in this case, the athlete put a lot of thought into which poses were performed in order to best suit his physique. Another feature of this posing routine that stood out was the transitions. The transitions seemed to be well thought out and tailored to each of the poses to make the routine flow much more easily. The transitions weren't very choppy, weren't very sloppy, and seemed to fit very well to the poses that the athlete chose. One last thing that I would like to point out would be time management. Take a look at how the athlete seems to have fit every single pose into the time allotted for the duration of the routine. Some routines are 60 seconds, some routines are 90 seconds, and depending on what organization, you may have longer or shorter to pose. In this case, the athlete seems to have had 60 seconds. He fit every single pose and every single transition into that 60 seconds. There was no point in time where the athlete ran out of poses or didn't know what to do. Usually this leads to being frustrated and embarrassed, and you start to do things on stage that you normally wouldn't do. Things that you might not have planned to do yourself, but have seen other competitors do, and therefore feel like it's a good idea. So it's best to make sure you time all of your poses and your transitions to fit inside the time allotted for the posing routine itself, and do not go over that time limit or do not go under that time limit as well.
Our next